everyone. This is Jeff. This is the fourth video in a series of videos that started with creating graphics in Illustrator, then 2, creating keyframes from audio by hand, and then 3, making movement with the move path, and then 4, this is just all about adding extra effects. This video is optional, but it's based in a couple of ideas that I like. There's this one thing called the Blob effect, which you can Google it and find lots of tutorials. I will show you one. And then I will continue to play with effects to see if I can get this to do even some crazier things. So this is less of a tutorial of exactly how to do something and more about a tutorial about how to play and experiment and have some fun looking for new ways to turn your graphics into something kind of bigger than the original thing you started with. So let me go ahead and start. So what I'm going to first start with is this is a universal technique that's good to know, is we have been able to go select individual objects and add effects to them. That was something that happened in the 6 foundations of After Effects. So what we can also do with effects is we can create layers, effect layers, and that's under Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. So what this does is it takes an adjustment layer, and everything that is below this adjustment layer will have whatever adjustments you do affect all of them below. So I'm going to go ahead and start with an effect, or 2 effects, that creates this kind of blur or blob effect. So the blob effect is created by going to Effects, and I have to have my adjustment layer selected, so when I add these effects they're going to the adjustment layer. I'm going to Effects, Blur and Sharpen, and this is all sorts of blur functions, and I'm going to select the Fast Box Blur. I'm going to go ahead and play with it. If you open it up, the Fast Box Blur, I'm going to open this radius to, let's say, 30-ish, maybe something like that, and you can actually see when we get to the animation that it actually affects all of the layers that we put below it. But it doesn't really look like a blob effect. It kind of looks just like your eyes are bad. So let's go ahead and fix that. So what the blur effect does is it basically creates a gradient out from whatever object you have. And if you add something called a choker, what it'll do is it'll pick a level of gradient that you're at and then kind of increase the contrast, meaning, well, I'll show you and maybe that'll be a better way to explain it. So the effect is called a choker, specifically a simple choker, and I'll turn on my highlighter here, so simple choker. And if I double click it, it's going to add it to this effects panel, and it's going to add it down here to the timeline under adjustment layers. So simple choker, what this does, if I go to the choke matte, if I move it up, see how it kind of makes the edges harder? But if I move it back, it'll still make the edges harder, but it'll make them bigger. So I think I'm going to leave it at about, I want it to get it till it's about hard edged. Because the more choke matte that I use, the more hard edged it's going to be. So it looks like a vector graphic. So I think that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and make it fit the screen. So that seems pretty good. So the blur, of course, kind of opens up a gradient around the object. And the choker basically, if you make the choke matte negative, will expand where the cutoff line between a solid object and a negative space behind it is. And if you make it a high number, it'll shrink, but it still cuts off that gradient. If that makes sense. So these are 2 functions that kind of work together. So I'm going to make this until it looks hard edge again. So it looks like -36. Often the blur radius and the choker are around the same number. That's a fast fact. And let's just go ahead and see how this works. I think it's going to look pretty good. And I'll turn on the music. Okay, so now I think I actually have a visual that kind of keeps the beat, which I think is pretty cool. So this now is just an example of how to play. I have now created a composition. It's called dots2, and I'm going to put this into a main composition. So even though we've been adding effects, you can see that when you add effects, the effects panel kind of replaces the project panel. And to get that back, all you have to do is select these two little buttons right there, and you can see you can go back to project. Okay, so here's dots. I'm going to go to my master composition, and I'm going to drag dots2 down here twice. And I'm going to play around with them. I'm going to keep the top one normal, but I'm going to hide it. And I'm going to add a bunch of effects to this bottom one. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the effects, and I'm going to use something called invert. And invert's just going to swap the color. And if I know that if I invert this kind of green, it's going to turn it red, which I think is kind of nice. And then, but if I stack them on top, they kind of disappear. So I'm going to actually flip this so I can see kind of some misalignment, and I think that's going to be kind of cool. And in fact, I could also just go into transform and kind of misalign it. So let's see what sort of effects we can get. I'm now just playing. So what I'm going to do with dots is I'm going to kind of flip it. I'm going to flip it three-dimensionally. So I'm going to turn on the 3D filter, and under transform, I'm going to flip the X. See, I'm literally flipping it to 180. I'll just type it in. Oops. And just for contrast, I'll show the top one. So they're kind of a little misaligned, which I think is cool. And then as it gets to the animation, they're going to kind of continue to be misaligned, and I think create some really interesting effects. So I'm going to I'll actually flip the X rotation 2, just so we have it's even less aligned. And then I'm going to add a layer blend mode to the top. And I'm going to make it, let's try multiply. And multiply, if you've gone through Photoshop, basically compares the top layer and the bottom layer, and it's going to push things towards dark. Anything in this section and either darken will push things towards dark. So I'm gonna stick with multiply, and let's just see what's gonna work. So you can see as the green and the red overlap, they kind of turn to a black. But because they're flipped, they are kind of creating these new shapes where they're overlapping. And because I didn't have them aligned perfectly, there's kind of a nice little accidental misalignment. And you could continue playing around with this until you just get endless variations of fun. See what we get here. Okay, that is beginning to feel like a really cool background. So the lesson here is a little bit prescriptive, and it tells you that yes, you can make a blob effect. You can add an adjustment layer that will affect lots of things below, but it's also just experimental. Is that singular effects and singular tricks often lead to predictable things, but the more that you kind of stack and stack and stack effects on top, the more you can start to get some really interesting things. All right, thank you. That's the end of line for this, and I will have another video that arcs through a whole other complex process.